To the athletes that quit running, the Lord said, "Stopped short." I saw him standing just off the track, blowing a whistle, trying to get their attention, and waving his hand in a gesture that meant keep going. And I heard, "It's not too late, get back in the race." Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for this installment of my weekly teachings. I'm Lori Hale. This is the latest in a series of teachings by Lamb International. My hope is that you're encouraged today by this program. What we'll be covering today is a timely and important word for those who feel discouraged to keep pressing into their Christian walk due to unmet expectations and disillusionment from the day-to-day grind, and even feel like just retreating from the battle in order to protect yourself from suffering more wounds and hurts from, the dealings of life. So let's dig in. I actually received this teaching in June of last year, but the Lord had me wait until now to release it because for more than a year we've been in a season of rebuilding. If you go to our website at lamminternational.net, you'll see some of the changes we've already made, and there are more to come. One of our short-term goals is to post a video teaching weekly, so stay tuned. As I sat with the Lord in preparation for this teaching, a vision dropped into my spirit along with the outline for the teaching that follows and a prophetic word, which I'll share at the very end of this video. To start off, I'm going to share the vision and the impressions I received. The vision began with the image of a racetrack with athletes positioned in lanes at a starting line. When the starting gun went off, each athlete began to run, encountering a series of hurdles blocking their path. As I watched, most of the runners cleared the first hurdle with relative ease. However, some of the runners came to a dead stop upon clearing the hurdle. The race continued as the athletes pressed on towards the next hurdle. Some runners leapt over the second hurdle only to stop on the other side, ending the race before completing it. I saw others in the field jump over a few more hurdles, but again stop before reaching the finish line. There was a single athlete that pulled away from the pack. She pressed on towards the finish line, undaunted by any of the obstacles that appeared before her. To the athletes that quit running, the Lord said, "Stopped short." I saw him standing just off the track, blowing a whistle, trying to get their attention, and waving his hand in a gesture that meant keep going. And I heard, "It's not too late, get back in the race." Here's what the Lord showed me concerning the vision. Even though one runner in the vision completed the race, showing us that it is possible to do so, the Lord focused on the three distinct groups of runners. Each runner in the race was a believer, with each hurdle symbolizing a point where they hesitated to follow the Lord, due to, for the most part, the suffering and sacrifice that would be involved if they were to continue running. The runners in each group started the race, but at various points along the way chose not to continue. The first group of believers are those who sustained spiritual and emotional wounds, but were attempting to suppress the reality of those injuries by saying, "I'm fine." And yet the injury was keeping them from running. Obviously, the Lord desires to bring healing, but a willingness on the part of believers to partner with the healing process is essential to properly care for their wounds or offenses. A willingness to seek His forgiveness and a willingness to forgive others and make amends. I heard Him say, "Let it go." And the Lord highlighted Ephesians 4:32, which says, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you." It's common from time to time for others to do things that can hurt us, but how we respond is our choice. Holding on to that offense and bearing a grudge is a choice that nobody forces upon us. That's on us. So we shouldn't expect the Lord to support our choice to remain offended. In fact, he tells us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. I sense that this is a hurdle so many aren't willing to overcome, but the consequence is real. It's preventing you from experiencing the more God has for you. This point is highlighted in the vision by those who are maintaining the same position on the track between the last hurdle they overcame and the one just ahead, not moving because their feet are dug into the ground. This is where the Lord again said, "Let it go." While some wounds can be relatively mild, others in this group experience more substantial wounds, requiring a great deal of healing, as if you're slowly peeling back the layers of an onion. Overcoming this type of hurt may seem impossible to us, but Jesus is able to restore even the deepest wounds of a broken heart because he understands what it means to be rejected and despised. He in turn asks us for a simple step of faith. Be willing to let down the walls we have built and allow him into those injured places. Moving on to the second group of believers in the vision, we see that they were hindered from completing the race because they were fixated on the hurdle that was directly in front of them, which appeared insurmountable. Instead of addressing the hurdle head on, these believers were attempting to avoid it altogether by trying to find a way around it. They had not anticipated the course being so difficult. However, when they shifted their gaze off the obstacle and onto the horizon, fixing their sights on Jesus, their legs suddenly grew much longer than humanly possible. They were then able to step right over the hurdle because they weren't relying on themselves to overcome it. I heard the words, legs of faith. Finally, the third group of believers were being discouraged from really running the race at all. A direct attack of the enemy was effectively averting their attention by lying to them, trying to convince them that there really was no time, wanting them to think it's too late to effectively run the race. But I heard the Lord say to these believers, as long as you have breath in your lungs and your body is able, keep pressing on. So now that the background to this week's teaching has been set, let's unpack the deeper underlying issues at hand. To begin with, the Lord spoke to me about a comparison between the early believers in the book of Hebrews and the runners in the vision. He showed me that both groups were struggling with the same issues: unrealized expectations, disillusionment, and self-protection. To better understand what the Lord is saying to us, we need to consider the broader narrative of the book of Hebrews. What we find is that the author was writing to encourage believers in Rome who were facing persecution and spiritual weariness, and who, like the believers in the vision, were ready to stop running the race of faith. They were wrestling with unrealized expectations. Simply put, unrealized expectations are when reality fails to match what we had imagined. A common thought held by the early ecclesia was that Jesus' return was imminent, quickly putting an end to their suffering. But as this expectation went unrealized and persecution increased, their hope began to wane. And since in the culture of that day, converting to Christianity would have been considered a shameful act, that choice would have not only brought about family rejection, but also the shunning from neighbors and friends, and be the cause of ongoing hardship. Those believers gave up everything to follow Jesus, expecting an immediate establishment of his kingdom, but instead experienced trial after trial with no end in sight. So while even today the decision to become a Christian is a serious one, for early believers that choice came at a great personal cost. Hebrews 10 gives us a brief description of the suffering they were facing. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Though they hadn't yet been persecuted to the point of shedding blood, as it says in verse 4, even still, the suffering they were enduring was enough to cause these believers to reconsider remaining loyal to Jesus. And while they had come to the full knowledge of Christ, the cost to follow him was not what they expected, leaving them disillusioned. The second issue we're going to unpack. To be disillusioned is to be dissatisfied or defeated in expectation or hope. As one quote says, to be disillusioned is to be stripped of your illusion. It's the opposite of illusion, which is reality and truth. How can any of us read about the trials which the early church endured and not empathize with their situation? It's easy to understand in a natural sense how it would play out. The temptation to give into the pressure coming against them would lead them to abandon their newfound faith altogether and turn back to the safety and familiarity of the old way of life. Those early believers we read about in Hebrews were struggling with disillusionment and were ready to give up. Reality had not matched their expectations, making the daily trials they experienced difficult to face. The pressure that came from the trials pressed in on those unsanctified and unsurrendered internal places of the heart, causing unbelief to rise up, leading them to fall into rebellion. We can see a similarity in the story of the Exodus. The children of Israel suffered profound disillusionment, thinking their journey from slavery to the Promised Land would be a quick trip up the coast, a smooth transition from the old into the new. They were not expecting to encounter the suffering and obstacles that came their way. Something the Lord pointed out, and which is a lesson for us today, was that with those early believers, their circumstances didn't exist as a result of sin, but that they were led to sin because of their circumstances. Although they were obediently following the Lord, the pressure of ongoing trials and persecution coming against them was driving their decision to walk away from the faith. When we as modern-day believers look at the children of Israel, we see a similar scenario. They were freed from captivity, being led towards their promised land. But their expectations of the journey ahead was much different than the reality they encountered. In chapter 3, the writer of Hebrews quotes Psalm 95, reminding his audience of what happened to the children of Israel because of their unbelief. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion, in the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers tested and tried me, and for 40 years saw my works. Therefore I was angry with that generation, and I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I swore an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. See to it, brothers, that none of you has a wicked heart of unbelief that turns away from the living God. The truth is that we too can be tempted to walk away from our faith when reality destroys the expectations we've embraced of what it means to serve the Lord. When major disappointments expose the illusions we hold about our faith, there's a temptation to throw in the towel and walk away from Jesus and the calling he's placed on our lives. This isn't how I thought it would go, or I never had that in mind, are common refrains that believers express all the time. Something else the Lord showed me was that for many believers, disillusionment happens for a couple of reasons. First, because they haven't been taught to expect suffering as part of every believer's life. And second, that there is actually a higher purpose behind the suffering when it occurs, which is spiritual discipline. And that is when I heard the Lord say, discipline is necessary. Don't be caught off guard that we're expected to learn to endure trials. Spiritual maturity is the goal which the Lord has set before us. And even at times asks us to step into a place of suffering as a means of discipline to spur us on in our spiritual growth. The writer of Hebrews clarifies this purpose in chapter 12. And you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons. My son, do not take lightly the discipline of the Lord, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastises every son he receives. Endure suffering as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you do not experience discipline like everyone else, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Furthermore, we have all had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Should we not much more submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a short time as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, so that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it yields a harvest of righteousness and peace to those who have been trained by it. It's completely understandable that our natural tendency is to run away from suffering, looking for the escape hatch when a trial comes our way. But as we just read, that as believers, we should not have a negative attitude towards the suffering we encounter, but see it as a divine instrument that the Lord is allowing to bring about His good in our lives. Unexpected suffering and delays, even setbacks, can tempt us to step into unbelief and revert to our old lives. However, turning our backs on Christ after experiencing the reality of His presence carries a profound and lasting danger. Hebrews 10 tells us, "For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries." The believers in Hebrews weren't just experiencing a temporary crisis of doubt or a momentary loss of faith. They were in danger of falling into apostasy, of making a conscious, willful choice to turn away from the Lord. They had tasted and seen, but the pressure of adversity was shaking their faith, causing them to run towards self-protection so as to avoid any further suffering. Now let's look at the third issue at hand, self-protection. The basic meaning of self-protection is the saving of self. In the spiritual context, self-protection speaks to the unsurrendered parts of our soul, those places within where we refuse to die to ourselves and follow Christ wholeheartedly. Our need to protect ourselves becomes an active rebellion of the will against the lordship of Jesus, standing in direct opposition to the great commandment which says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. In this current generation of believers, many hold the illusion that God is here to make their lives easier, which sadly ignores scriptural warnings that trials are inevitable. When hardship strikes, they are caught off guard. Just like the struggling believers in Hebrews, they have counted the cost of following Jesus, realized the steep price of obedience, and are seriously considering turning back. They are unwilling to take up their cross and follow Jesus when it requires genuine suffering. As I previously shared in another teaching, several years ago the Lord spoke to us, asking my husband and I to take a step of what some have referred to as radical obedience, where we walked away from our jobs, gave away all of our money and most of our possessions to live entirely by faith. We had built up an expectation which was fostered by pulpit teachings from our then church leadership and the testimony of others that such immense faith would instantly yield miraculous provision. The reality, however, was a difficult trial of hardship and adversity, facing hurdle after hurdle, uncertain of when the season would end. We were ridiculed, misunderstood, lost relationships, labeled as frauds, and even called foolish. And while by God's grace we didn't wind up on the streets, still, His provision looked nothing like we had imagined or even expected. While during those days we did shed a lot of the immature thinking that was holding us back, a change in how we viewed the trials we were facing was required. We had to have a change in mindset, rethinking what following Christ truly meant. Every trial became another opportunity to break free from self-protection. By placing us in situations we could never resolve on our own, God invited us to surrender the deepest, most hidden parts of our hearts to Him. Much like champion hurdlers who embrace self-denial and push past discomfort to win, we faced spiritual hurdles. Succeeding required submitting to the Lord's discipline. We had to abandon our natural defenses, align our thoughts with His kingdom, and silence the inner voice whispering defeat in order to avoid relying on our flesh and turning back to self-protection. As believers, to conquer the hurdle of self-protection, we must cast aside doubt and confidently embrace the mindset of a winner. The Lord then impressed upon me these verses from Hebrews. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before Him, He endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider Him who endured from sinners such hostility against Himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Using the imagery of an ancient foot race, this passage of Scripture provides 4 points of action to help us train our thoughts, maintain our focus, and run our race with endurance. The first point of action: believers are told to cast off the sin that so easily entangles. This means to discard with intentionality anything that slows down our spiritual growth. The original Greek refers to the shedding of loose clothing to run a race, representing the urgent removal of entangling sins. The New Testament meaning for the word sin is to miss the mark. The term entangles means to keep from running, as with a persistent obstacle. And so self-protection is acting like a persistent obstacle that is attempting to undermine our spiritual progress in order to keep us running from the race we have been called to run. We overcome that entangling sin of self-protection by confronting the thoughts that fuel it. To do this, we must closely examine our internal dialogue. Ask yourself, are my thoughts pushing me to shield myself? Am I letting past pain, whether from unexpected hardships, betrayal, or the exhaustion of waiting, to become a barrier to fully submitting to the Lord and His discipline? It's important to acknowledge the sin of self-protection before the Lord, and then to choose to think again, to actively resist the urge to fall back into the practice of self-protection by making the choice to put off our old way of thinking and instead be renewed in the spirit of our minds, and to put on the new self, which is created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. The second point of action is to run with perseverance, or patient endurance, the race set before us. To gain a fuller understanding of what running with perseverance means, we look at its New Testament meaning, which is the ability to maintain purpose under pressure. It is to actively bear up under suffering and trials without giving up, to maintain determination. Running with determination to overcome the hurdles before us, which, in keeping with this teaching, is the hurdle of self-protection. The second half of the phrase tells us that there is a race set before us, a predetermined course which the Lord has in mind. We don't decide the manner in which we run or the lay of the course. Now, while in the natural sense the hurdles on a racetrack are easy to see, in the spiritual race, we lack the ability to detect the hurdles or trials ahead of time. But because the Lord has already traveled the entire length of the course, from the end to the beginning, we can trust that He is already aware of each one and is using those obstacles for our benefit, as the means of discipline, not as punishment, but to move us along in our spiritual maturity. James 1:2-4 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you encounter trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Allow perseverance to finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Perseverance pushes past the disillusionment of unmet expectations and does not focus on the pain that comes with running. It stays the course even though the track doesn't look quite as expected. Some of you may not be familiar with the name Ronaldo Nehemiah, but his story is a great example of perseverance. In American hurdling, his name is legendary because this Christian athlete accomplished what most thought was impossible when he broke the 13-second barrier in men's high hurdles. And though he secured a place on the American Olympic team and earned the right to compete in the 1980 Summer Olympics, an unexpected hurdle blocked his path. Nehemiah's long-held Olympic dream was abruptly halted with America's boycott of the Games over the Soviet-Afghan conflict. While President Carter allowed Winter Olympians to compete, he refused to make an exception for the Summer Games, leaving Nehemiah and the other athletes on the American team watching their chance of Olympic gold vanish into thin air. But that setback was not the end of his story. Nehemiah persevered. Though he acknowledges feeling angry and disillusioned over what he considered an unjust exercise of authority, he refused to let one race define his future. Instead, he transitioned to the NFL, playing 4 years with the San Francisco 49ers and earning a different kind of championship gold, a Super Bowl ring. Rather than remaining sidelined, he got back in the race. And while life did not turn out exactly as he imagined, Nehemiah now uses his platform to inspire others to keep running, no matter what hurdles stand in their way. The third point of action, which is in verse 2, tells us to fix our eyes on Jesus. The idea underlining the word fix in the Greek means to look away from all other objects in order to concentrate intently on one. So instead of focusing our attention on the trial or what we are suffering, our gaze should constantly rest on Jesus. Applying this method of disciplining our thoughts so that they align with the mind of Christ will ultimately break the sinful habit of self-protection. Ask yourself, am I thinking in alignment with the Lord's standards of holiness? Now, most of you probably remember that popular acronym from a while back, WWJD, or What Would Jesus Do? This actually originated with Spurgeon back in 1891, but was adapted and shortened by a youth leader in 1989 as a simple reminder for the youth she was leading to look to Jesus first before making decisions in their lives. To find out what Jesus would do, we need only to look at what he did and then follow his lead. In the second part of verse 2, describes Jesus as the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. A pioneer sets the course for others to follow. A perfecter is one who has brought something to a successful completion. When we look at what Jesus did, we see that he has already not only established the trail of faith we are to follow, but also finished it. His example is superior to any other. So then, to defeat any hurdle along our path, even the hurdle of self-protection, the answer is always and only ever Jesus. The fourth point of action is to consider him. In Hebrews 11, it lists some of the heroes of faith. At the end of the passage, it describes the suffering endured by those early believers. Throughout the Faith Hall of Fame, the writer makes the point that what's being described is not faith in general or faith in God, but rather it's faith that God will fulfill his promises, even though those who received the promises did not live to see the fulfillment. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and in caves of the earth. Not to make light of what some of us are walking through right now, but most modern-day believers will never have to undergo that kind of intense suffering. Yet even without having the full revelation of the promise, they still stood firm in their faith. However, the writer of Hebrews does not tell his audience to consider any of those heroes of faith. He tells us to consider him, to consider Jesus, as his sacrifice was far superior to them all. The term consider in this context is more than just a momentary remembrance or a passing thought. It means to calculate, compare, and weigh. Then to consider him is to intentionally focus on what Jesus suffered and compare it to our own trials. This comparison is meant to reveal that our own struggles are light in comparison to the pain and suffering he endured on the cross. Now, we can't control the trials that come into our lives, but we can control our response to them. If we recognize that the Lord is asking us to face this hurdle for our own good, it's much easier to let down our walls of protection and face the trials with a joyful attitude. Think about the disciples in Acts 5. It tells us that the disciples counted it a privilege to suffer shame for the name of Jesus. It says, "And when they had called for the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. So they," meaning the disciples, "departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house, they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ." Despite the suffering they had already endured, the disciples kept running the race set before them, even though they knew further persecution likely awaited them. If they could withstand such extreme hardship without losing faith, then we are more than equipped to conquer each hurdle that comes our way. Now, before I close, there is a letter that the Lord asked me to share today. It's time to tear down the walls, those barriers my children have erected within to keep me out. For surely do the souls of those children remain in an unsurrendered state, as they have yet to fully yield themselves to the working of my hand. And so, like a stagnant pool, have they become, due to their refusal to advance in the sanctification process that is required of all who are found in my Son. See then, do those walled-off areas of their soul remain firmly in place, for these children seek to protect themselves from suffering any pain. For surely do they think suffering should not be their lot, and so are reluctant to let their walls down. Thus are they responsible for hindering their own spiritual growth. Ah, then, the spiritual discernment of these children is underdeveloped to such an extent that they cannot perceive that I have a higher purpose for the pain and suffering that crosses their paths. And so they should not automatically recoil when difficulties arise in their lives. For there is something greater to be gained by enduring the pain of each trial that comes along, no matter what it is. Therefore, avoidance should not be considered an option. Yet, because self-protection is a part of man's carnal nature, each believer must learn how to overcome that internal obstacle. As such, should each trial be viewed as an opportunity to kill off that habit by dying to themselves, for that is the only way for them to grow more into the likeness of my Son. Therefore, none of my children should despise the trials that they endure, for suffering is the means that I use to shape them into His image, and so unto each of their lives shall suffering come. So then the way forward is to embrace the trials of life and not look for a way around them. Yet avoidance is the direction those children have chosen. For to remain just as they are, to them, seems a better route, and as such, refuse to submit to my sanctification process. For surely does pride still dwell within them. Sadly shall their determination to follow my Son only wane, as long as the obstacle of self-protection is allowed to remain. For to them, amending their ways seems too difficult a task. And so, in a constant state of immaturity, shall those children continue to be, as the hurdle of self-protection must be defeated if they are to know any real and lasting growth. So while these children wrongly thought that following my Son would be a walk in the park, for they believed that by inviting Him into their hearts, that He would enhance the life they were already living. Instead, He required them to change. And so have those children been overtaken by disillusionment, for they misinterpreted what being a disciple of Christ would actually entail. Much like those early Israelite believers long ago who were on the verge of rejecting their newfound faith. Yet were they encouraged to maintain their course by remembering that the eternal reward awaiting those who remain faithful until the end is worth much more than the cost of any suffering encountered in this life. Whether that be actual literal persecution or the ongoing act of dying to oneself and the difficulties involved in that struggle. Then knowing that, none of my own should become disenchanted with their journey of faith simply because they've encountered trials of various kinds, especially when the Scriptures plainly warn them to expect such occurrences. Therefore, none should be taken aback when suffering imposes itself upon them, as the pain and discomfort it evokes is meant to be the wedge that drives open the space for internal breakthrough, so that the walls of self-protection are completely broken down. For indeed have I come in this hour to set my children free from that which is inhibiting their spiritual growth and maturity. See then, this sinful practice of self-protection must be cast off, for indeed is it holding those children back from walking in the fullness of who I created them to be. Thus should they quickly lay down their pride and in humble surrender choose instead to operate in the mind of Christ, so that their thoughts align with the precepts of my kingdom and are no longer governed by the dictates of self-protection. Therefore should each of my children always keep their gaze fixed upon Him, so that their faith does not falter, even when they find themselves undergoing the most difficult trials. For surely is He the perfect example for my children to follow. Thus should they first consider Him and His response to suffering, and then follow suit. For surely then shall those walls of self-protection be easily torn down. Then to my own, those that have erected walls of self-protection, do I say, it's time to tear down the walls. So then look no further than Jesus, for He alone is the answer. Look to Him, and those barriers you have erected between us shall surely fall. Therefore, do not be afraid to walk through this painful process, for I have come to mend that which is broken within you. So then do I say again, tear down the walls and let me in. Thank you again for joining me today.